The Simpsons has been on the air since December 17th, 1989. 37 seasons, 803 episodes, as of December 2025. It is the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running American sitcom, the longest-running scripted primetime show in the entire history of television. No other show has ever come close to what this one has done. Not in volume, not in cultural reach, not in sheer, uninterrupted endurance. If you started watching every episode back-to-back right now, without stopping, without sleeping, it would take you roughly 2 weeks before you saw the last one. And in all of that time, across all of those episodes, across 36 years of Bart getting into trouble, and Homer making catastrophically bad decisions, and Marge holding everything together through sheer exhausted love, there is a graveyard. A quiet, mostly unacknowledged collection of episodes that were taken away, pulled from the air, erased from streaming libraries, banned by governments, threatened with lawsuits, buried by the people who made them. Episodes that were loved and then were gone. Tonight, we are going into that graveyard. We are going to spend the next 2 hours sitting with 11 episodes of The Simpsons that the world decided you should not be able to watch, and we are going to talk about why. Not the surface reasons, not the press release versions, the real reasons. The cultural fracture lines that each one exposed. The moment in time each one got caught inside. The specific thing each one said about who we are and how we watch and what we are willing to forgive. Some of what we find is straightforward. Some of it is complicated in ways that do not resolve neatly. And one of these stories, the first one, is about something that was beloved, genuinely beloved for 28 years, before the people who made it decided that keeping it was wrong. That is the one we start with, because there is exactly one episode of The Simpsons that does not exist anymore, in any official sense. One episode that is not on Disney+. One episode that will not appear in any future syndication package, in any country, on any channel. One episode that future box sets will not include. The people who wrote it, the people who produced it, the people who spent months crafting it and loved it and watched it become part of the cultural fabric of the late 20th century. They looked at it in March of 2019 and said, "This cannot stay." They made that decision on purpose, with full knowledge of what they were losing. That episode is Stark Raving Dad, Season 3, Episode 1. It aired on September 19th, 1991. And before we go any further, let's be precise about what it actually was, because people who did not watch it tend to assume it was controversial when it aired. It was not. Not remotely. At the time of its premiere, Stark Raving Dad was considered one of the finest half hours The Simpsons had ever produced. Critics praised it, fans loved it. The episode was ranked for years as one of the show's essential installments, a top-tier Simpsons story in the period that most fans consider the show's golden age. It was the kind of episode people would cite when explaining why The Simpsons mattered. Not one of the bigger, splashier episodes, one of the quieter ones. One of the ones that worked because it was genuinely warm. Here is what happens in it. Bart throws his lucky red cap into the laundry along with Homer's white work shirts. The shirts come out pink. Homer is forced to wear a pink shirt to the Springfield nuclear power plant where Mr. Burns notices and decides that anyone willing to wear a pink shirt to work must be, in Burns's phrasing, some kind of free-thinking anarchist. Homer is sent home with a psychological evaluation to complete. He lets Bart fill it out. Bart, being Bart, checks every box without reading the questions. Homer hands it in. The results indicate severe mental instability. Homer is committed to a psychiatric institution. There, he is assigned to a room with a large, heavy-set man who introduces himself simply as Michael Jackson. He speaks in Michael Jackson's voice. He claims fully and sincerely to be the most famous entertainer in the world. Homer, who has never heard of Michael Jackson and does not know who that is, believes him entirely and strikes up a genuine friendship with this gentle, unusual man. The man's name is Leon Kompowski. He is a bricklayer from Paterson, New Jersey. He is not Michael Jackson. But he speaks like him because he discovered at some point in his life that when he talked in Michael Jackson's voice, people were nicer to him. People smiled, people listened, people did not flinch. The voice made the world more bearable. The episode ends with Bart forgetting Lisa's birthday, something he does every year, and Leon helping Bart write and record a birthday song for her. The song is quiet and a little clumsy and completely sincere. Lisa cries. She tells Bart it is the best present she has ever received. Then Leon says goodbye to the Simpsons, walks out the door, and is heard in the distance singing "Happy Birthday, Lisa" to himself, in his real voice, the voice of a bricklayer from New Jersey, not a king of pop. Just a man who found something that made people happy and held on to it. That is Stark Raving Dad. That is the episode that no longer officially exists. Now here is the thing that makes this story something other than a simple production decision. The voice of Leon Kompowski was Michael Jackson himself, not a sound-alike, not an impression. Michael Jackson, who was in 1991 the most famous entertainer on the planet, who had sold more albums than almost anyone in history, who was at the absolute peak of his cultural authority, had called Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, and asked to be on the show. He was a Bart Simpson fan. He loved the character. He wanted in. His involvement was a secret at first. He was credited in the episode as John J. Smith, a pseudonym, and for years his role was officially unconfirmed, only widely rumored. It was not until a later episode that the show itself gave a more open hint, when Lisa casually mentioned that both Dustin Hoffman and Michael Jackson had made cameo appearances in a movie, adding that they had not used their real names, but you could tell it was them. Jackson did not just show up and read lines, he had thoughts about the story. He contributed ideas. The scene where Bart tells everyone in Springfield that Michael Jackson is coming to his house was Jackson's pitch. He requested that a joke about Prince be changed to one about Elvis Presley. He asked for a scene where Bart and Leon write a song together, and then he wrote the song himself. Happy Birthday. Lisa was Michael Jackson's creation, written for an 8-year-old cartoon character and performed with the same sincerity he brought to everything else. The read-through for the episode was held at the home of Jackson's manager, Sandy Gallen. Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer Simpson, arrived 30 minutes late. The room waited in complete silence. Nobody spoke, nobody complained. They sat there until he arrived, because Michael Jackson was in the room, and when Michael Jackson was in the room in 1991, that is what you did. The episode aired. It was a cultural event. It was treasured, which is the specific word that James L. Brooks, the executive producer of The Simpsons, would later use to describe it. Treasured, not just successful. Treasured. That word matters, and we're going to come back to it. For the next 18 years, Stark Raving Dad existed in The Simpsons catalog without controversy. When Jackson died on June 25, 2009, Fox intended to air the episode as a tribute 3 days later. Syndication rights complications prevented that. They aired the Do the Bartman music video instead, a song Jackson had secretly contributed to while working on the show, and then broadcast the episode on July 5, 2009, 10 days after his death, as an explicit memorial to the man who made it possible. The episode was beloved. The episode was safe. The episode was part of the permanent record of what The Simpsons was. And then, in March of 2019, everything changed. In early March 2019, the HBO documentary Leaving Neverland began broadcasting. It was a 2-part film directed by Dan Reed, and it featured 2 men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, giving detailed accounts of alleged sexual abuse by Michael Jackson when they were children. The documentary was 4 hours long. It was specific. It was graphic in ways that documentaries about this subject almost never are. It placed the viewer inside these accounts without flinching, and it left most people who watched it with very little room for comfortable ambiguity. James L. Brooks watched it. He found it, in his own words, convincing and heartbreaking. On March 8, 2019, one day after the documentary's second part aired, Brooks contacted Matt Groening and Al Jean, the showrunner of The Simpsons, and told them what he had concluded. The 3 of them talked, and then Brooks told the Wall Street Journal what they had decided. He said, "It feels clearly the only choice to make." He said, "The guys I work with, where we spend our lives arguing over jokes, were of one mind on this." And then he said something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said, "This was a treasured episode, and this certainly does not allow them to remain. Not the memories of making it, the memories themselves, the good ones, the warmth he felt toward it, the fondness for everything that went into it. Watching Leaving Neverland did not change what the episode was. It did not reach back in time and make the birthday song worse, or the story clumsier, or the performances less sincere. The episode was exactly what it had always been. But Brooks was saying that knowing what he now believed he knew, he could not hold on to the warmth. The warmth and the knowledge could not coexist. So the warmth had to go. He said he was against book burning of any kind. He said it anyway. The decision to pull Stark Raving Dad did not come from Disney. It did not come from Fox. It did not come from lawyers concerned about liability or executives worried about public relations. It came from the writer's room, from the people who spent their careers arguing over jokes, to use Brooks's phrase, and who now agreed unanimously that this was not a difficult call. Al Jean confirmed his alignment simply, telling Variety, "I agree with Jim. Nothing else to add." The episode was removed from FXX's streaming section. It was removed from syndication packages. Disney Plus, when it launched in November of 2019 with every completed season of The Simpsons available, did not include it. The Season 3 DVD set, released in 2003, remains the only official way to watch Stark Raving Dad. Those discs are now out of print. The episode exists in digital form only in bootlegs and fan archives. Officially, it is simply not there. Think about what The Simpsons catalog looks like when you try to access Season 3 on Disney Plus. You go to the episode list. There are 24 episodes in Season 3. You will find episodes 2 through 24. The season premiere is missing. There is a gap where the first episode of the season should be. The show's golden era has a hole in it right at the beginning, and most people scroll past it without noticing. There is something about that gap that feels important, and I want to take a moment with it before we move on. The obvious read is that this was the right call, that the allegations in Leaving Neverland were serious enough that platforming a loving tribute to Jackson, however innocent the content of the episode itself, was no longer something The Simpsons could do in good conscience. That the warmth of Happy Birthday Lisa, precisely because it was warm, had become a problem. That the episode made it harder, not easier, for people who had been harmed to feel like the culture was taking their pain seriously. That reading has real weight to it. But there is another thing sitting alongside it that deserves acknowledgement. Not to contradict the decision, but to hold the full complexity of what happened. James L. Brooks used the word treasured in the past tense. He used it to describe something he was choosing to lose. He was not dismissive of what was being buried. He was grieving it. The same emotional sincerity that went into making the episode, the same care that produced a birthday song that made a cartoon 8-year-old cry, went into the decision to take it away. The people who made Stark Raving Dad are not the people who erased it. They are the same people. And they decided that the thing they loved had to go, because love is not the only thing that matters when someone has been hurt. The only Simpsons episode in history to be pulled from all official distribution everywhere at once permanently was not a bad episode. It was not a cheap episode or a careless episode. It was, by most accounts, one of the best episodes the show ever made. And now it lives in a 2003 box set that you cannot buy new and a graveyard on a streaming platform where the first episode of Season 3 used to be. That is the weight of this one. And we are carrying it as we go forward because every episode on this list is a different version of the same question. What do we do with the things we loved when the world tells us we can no longer hold them the way we used to? We start with the one where the answer came from inside the building. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. There is one more layer to the Stark Raving Dad story that tends to get lost in the coverage of its removal, and it is the layer that tells you the most about what kind of episode it actually was. The entire premise of the story, the whole mechanism that drives it, is a case of mistaken identity that the show resolves not through revelation of a fact, but through understanding of a feeling. Leon Kompowski is not Michael Jackson. He has never been Michael Jackson. He is a bricklayer from Paterson, New Jersey, whose real voice is deep and ordinary and nothing like the voice of the world's most famous entertainer. He has spent time in psychiatric care because he would not stop talking in Michael Jackson's voice in public, which made the people around him conclude that he had lost his grip on reality. The doctors did not understand, and Homer did not understand what the audience gradually understands over the course of the episode. That Leon knows exactly who he is. He is not delusional. He is not confused. He is a man who discovered that one particular way of speaking to the world made the world more receptive to him. That the voice did something his own voice could not do. that people smiled when he spoke like Michael Jackson and flinched when he spoke like himself. The episode never asks you to decide whether Leon is right or wrong to do this. It does not resolve the ethics of his choice. What it does is let you sit with the fact that he leaves the Simpsons household singing "Happy Birthday, Lisa" in his real voice to himself as he walks away. Not for anyone else, not to make anyone smile, just because the song was worth singing in whatever voice he had. That is the thing that was buried, not the Michael Jackson guest appearance, not the celebrity cameo or the novelty of the pseudonym or the cultural event of the episode's premiere. The thing that was buried is that ending, that specific quiet gesture of a man singing to himself because the song deserved to be sung, walking away down a street in Springfield while the credits rolled. You cannot watch that ending on any official platform anymore. The production of Stark Raving Dad was surrounded by secrecy from the beginning. Jackson's involvement was not publicly confirmed for years. He appeared in the credits only as John J. Smith. Matt Groening, appearing on The Jay Leno Show around the time of the episode's premiere, was asked directly whether the voice was Jackson's. He did not say yes. He hinted, strongly enough that the audience knew, but he did not confirm. The show leaned into the ambiguity. It was not until a later episode that the series itself provided its most open acknowledgement, through Lisa's casual mention of celebrity guest appearances in a fictional film. The secrecy was partly Jackson's preference and partly practical. Jackson was a figure of such overwhelming public presence in 1991 that his confirmed involvement in any project immediately became the only thing anyone could talk about regarding that project. By appearing under a pseudonym, the episode could be about the story it was telling rather than about the story of his guest appearance. The episode could be about Leon and Lisa and a birthday song rather than about Michael Jackson doing a voice on The Simpsons. There is something elegant about that choice in retrospect. The episode is more about Leon Kompowski than it is about Michael Jackson, even though they share the same voice. Leon is the point. The man who is not who he sounds like is the point. The birthday song is the point. Jackson's involvement made the episode possible and gave it a weight it could not have had otherwise, but the story survives without the celebrity frame. It is still, at its core, a story about Bart forgetting something that matters and finding an unexpected way to fix it. And it is a story about someone who found a voice that worked better than his own and used it to do something kind. That story is still in the episode. The episode is still in that 2003 DVD box set, if you own a copy, if you can find one. And the story is still the same story it was in 1991. The decision to bury it did not change what it was. It changed whether the people who made it were willing to let it keep circulating in a world where the man whose voice Leon borrowed had been credibly accused of horrific things. They decided they were not willing, and they were in a position to make that decision. The gap on Season 3's episode list on Disney Plus is approximately one scroll's worth of distance. If you go looking for it, you will not find it. If you're not looking, you might never notice. The show goes on around it. 24 episodes in Season 3, and the first slot is empty. And the season's opening story about a pink shirt and a birthday song and a bricklayer from New Jersey who found a way to make the world smile has been replaced by nothing. That is the specific shape of what was lost. Something else lives inside the Stark Raving Dad story that has not been fully said yet. And it concerns the specific year the episode premiered and what Michael Jackson represented in that year. September 1991 was approximately 2 months before the release of Dangerous, the album that would go on to sell more than 30 million copies worldwide and cement Jackson's position as the most successful recording artist in history. He was at the absolute apex of the public version of his life. His fame in 1991 was of a scale that is genuinely difficult to communicate to anyone who did not experience it in real time. There was no one more famous. There was no cultural figure whose participation in any project was more significant simply by virtue of the participation itself. And he called Matt Groening and asked to be on The Simpsons. He asked to be on a show about an animated family from a fictional American town because he was a fan of Bart Simpson. Because the show delighted him, because he wanted to contribute something to it. He came in under a pseudonym, contributed ideas, wrote a song for a cartoon 8-year-old, and cared enough about the script that he would not commit to doing it until after a full read-through. The most famous person in the world sat in his manager's house and waited for the voice of Homer Simpson to arrive so the table read could begin. That detail, Dan Castellaneta being 30 minutes late to a read-through with Michael Jackson, and the room sitting in complete silence until he arrived, is one of those production anecdotes that reveals something about scale. The room waited because Michael Jackson was in it, and that was not a small thing in 1991. That was the entire weight of a cultural moment sitting in a house in Los Angeles waiting for a man who was late. The episode that came out of that meeting is the one that no longer officially exists. The most famous person in the world contributed to it. It aired as the premiere of The Simpsons' third season. It was loved for 28 years. And then the people who made it buried it, because the warmth of what it contained had become inseparable from information they could not ignore. The song is still somewhere. Happy Birthday. Lisa, written by Michael Jackson for a cartoon 8-year-old in 1991, exists in the recordings that people who own the old DVD set can still access. It has not been unmade. The decision to pull the episode did not reach back in time and unwrite the song. But it removed the context in which most people experienced it. The song without the episode is just a recording. The episode without the song is missing its emotional center. The two things belong together, and now they exist in a state of official separation that feels like the kind of ending the show itself might have written if it were trying to make a point about loss. The Simpsons has made many points about loss over 37 seasons. Homer losing his mother, Marge losing her sense of who she is when the family needs her to be someone she is not, Bart losing the version of himself that people believe in, Lisa losing, continuously and without resolution, the belief that things will get better. The show understands loss as well as any television series has ever understood it, because the show was made by people who understood it, and the characters they created carried that understanding through every season. Stark Raving Dad is its own version of the show's long relationship with loss, not a character losing something inside the narrative. The show itself losing something it could not keep, a piece of its own history buried by the people who made it, because the right thing to do was to lose it. And the show went on because The Simpsons always goes on into season 4 and season 10 and season 20 and season 37 and counting, carrying the gap at the top of season 3 like a scar that most people will never notice, but that is absolutely there. In the record, in the absence, where the first episode of the third season should be. That is what the graveyard contains, not failures, not embarrassments, things that were loved too much to be kept the way they were, in a world that had changed enough to make keeping them wrong. The second episode on this list is the only one to be banned, not because of anything that was in it, but because of something that happened 4 years after it aired. The content did not change. The writing did not become more offensive with time. The performances did not grow more callous. Nothing inside the episode shifted at all between its original broadcast and the moment it was pulled from rotation. The world changed around it. And suddenly, 30 minutes of television about Homer Simpson's car being illegally parked in Lower Manhattan became unwatchable. The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson is Season 9, Episode 1 of The Simpsons. It aired on September 21, 1997. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the stronger episodes from the show's later golden period. Smart writing. A New York City that feels lived in rather than a series of postcards. Homer at his most recognizably human, which is to say, irritated by things that are genuinely irritating, trapped in a situation that escalates through his own stubbornness and the indifference of bureaucracy. The episode is funny. It is sharply observed. It earned good reviews when it aired. Here's what happens. Barney Gumble, Homer's best friend and the town's resident alcoholic, is appointed designated driver for a night out. The group ends up in New York City. Barney disappears. Several weeks later, a letter arrives at the Simpson household informing Homer that his car has been located, illegally parked, and is accumulating fines at a location between the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Homer must go to Manhattan to retrieve it. The problem is that Homer hates New York City. This is established early in the episode and never really resolved. He hates it with the specific, unreasonable, total conviction that only Homer Simpson can sustain. He had a bad experience there once. He was mugged. Someone did something unpleasant involving a horse. He does not want to go. He goes anyway because the fines are mounting. Marge takes the children to see Manhattan, while Homer navigates the World Trade Center plaza trying to retrieve his car. The car is clamped, the attendant's booth is unattended. Homer is left waiting alone in the shadow of the Twin Towers, growing increasingly furious in his uniquely ineffectual way. The show uses the towers as setting. They are in many shots. They are part of the geography of the episode the way the Empire State Building or Central Park might be. Landmarks that establish place without calling attention to themselves as significant. The episode aired in September 1997. 4 years passed. The show was in its 11th season. The episode had been in syndication without incident for the entire time. And then September 11th, 2001 arrived. In the days and weeks that followed the attacks, networks across the United States began quietly pulling content that featured the World Trade Center prominently. This was not a coordinated directive, it was a collective, instinctive response. Television executives, syndication managers, local affiliate programmers, all making individual judgment calls that converged on the same conclusion. Some things were too raw to broadcast right now. The city of New York versus Homer Simpson was among them. It was removed from rotation. Canada pulled it. The United Kingdom pulled it out of respect for the victims and their families. The gap in the schedule was not announced with particular fanfare. The episode simply stopped appearing. Over the following years, as time passed and the acute phase of grief shifted into something more managed and permanent, the episode returned. But not entirely. Certain versions that aired in the mid-2000s had specific scenes edited. One line was cut in some broadcasts, a line in which Homer, furious about the parking situation, grumbles that they stick all the jerks in Tower 1. That line, which in 1997 was a throwaway gag about Homer's characteristic self-pity, had become something that a network editor in 2002 could not leave in without flinching. The episode is now available on Disney Plus with a content warning. The full version with that line is accessible. The ban, unlike the ban on Stark Raving Dad, was not permanent. It was a ban shaped by grief rather than by moral conviction. And grief, unlike moral conviction, is subject to time. This is the distinction that matters most when thinking about the city of New York versus Homer Simpson. Stark Raving Dad was pulled because the people who made it decided it was wrong to keep it. The city of New York was pulled because the culture was not ready for it. One of those is a judgment, the other is a wound. Wounds heal, or at least scar over. Judgments do not always change. There is something almost unbearably poignant about what the episode now is. Not what it was in 1997, when it was just a good television episode about a man trying to get his car out of a parking situation. What it is now, which is an accidental historical document, a record of what the Twin Towers looked like as background architecture. What they looked like when they were just buildings, part of a skyline, part of a setting, part of a joke about Homer Simpson being annoyed at the city. The show did not intend to memorialize them, it was just setting a scene. But the world moved and the scene became something else. And for several years after September 2001, the simple act of watching Homer wait in that plaza felt like standing somewhere you were not supposed to be. Not because the episode did anything wrong, because the buildings did not exist anymore, because the place where Homer was standing had become a place where thousands of people had died. The episode returned. The buildings did not. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The third episode on this list is consistently ranked among the 10 best episodes The Simpsons has ever made. Its IMDb rating sits at approximately 9.2 out of 10, which places it in the very top tier of the show's entire run across 37 seasons. Critics list it as essential Simpsons. Fans cite it as one of the most daring and technically accomplished half hours the show produced in its golden era. It is beloved with the kind of conviction that comes from an episode that does something genuinely surprising and then trusts the audience to stay with it. Germany banned it. Cape Fear is Season 5, Episode 2 of The Simpsons. It aired on October 7th, 1993. It is a direct parody of two films, the 1962 thriller Cape Fear, directed by J. Lee Thompson and starring Robert Mitchum, and the 1991 Martin Scorsese remake starring Robert De Niro. The episode follows Sideshow Bob, voiced by Kelsey Grammer, who is released from prison and immediately resumes his obsessive pursuit of Bart Simpson with the intent to murder him. The Simpson family enters the Federal Witness Relocation Program, changes their name to the Thompsons, and moves to Terror Lake. Sideshow Bob follows, gets aboard their houseboat, and proceeds to threaten Bart at length and with great theatrical enthusiasm. The episode is famous for many things. The opening sequence in which Bart receives increasingly menacing letters that ultimately spell out, in Sideshow Bob's handwriting, "I will kill you." The scene in which Bart, stalling for time, tricks Sideshow Bob into singing the entire score of the HMS Pinafore. And the rake sequence. The rake sequence is the thing that most people who love this episode remember. Sideshow Bob, approaching the houseboat through tall grass in the gathering dark, carrying a machete, steps on a rake. The rake handle swings up and hits him in the face. He reacts with pain and dignity, because Sideshow Bob always has a certain dignity about him even when being hit by things. He steps forward, he steps on another rake, another swing, another impact. He steps forward, another rake, and again, 11 times in total, with the same sound effect, the same pained reaction, the same methodical indignation, in complete silence except for the sound of rakes meeting a face. 11 times, without a break, without escalation or variation. Just 11 rakes, 11 impacts, and Kelsey Grammer's voice cycling through increasingly resigned expressions of discomfort. It should not be funny after the third one. It becomes funnier every time. By the 11th, it is almost unbearable. The joke works precisely because the show refuses to stop, refuses to cut away, refuses to provide the nervous relief of moving on. It trusts that you will follow it all the way to the end of the absurdity. And when you do, you understand something about comedy that is difficult to articulate through any other means. Germany did not get to see this episode for 14 years. The reason had nothing to do with Sideshow Bob or Bart or the rake sequence or the machete or the HMS Pinafore. It had to do with 4 seconds of background costuming in a scene involving a fictional television program called Up Late with McBain. McBain is a recurring character in The Simpsons, a parody of 1980s action movie heroes, played with stone-faced commitment by a man named Rainier Wolfcastle. He appears throughout the series in brief clips from his fictional film career, action sequences that parody the genre's conventions. In Cape Fear, there's a brief scene from what appears to be a late-night show hosted by McBain. In that scene, an announcer is visible in the background wearing a uniform. The uniform is an SS officer's uniform, the uniform of the Schutzstaffel, the paramilitary organization that served as the enforcement arm of the Nazi Party in Germany during the Second World War. The use of that uniform as a visual gag, a throwaway piece of background costuming, something that most American viewers in 1993 registered as a quick joke about fascist aesthetics and moved past in a fraction of a second, violated German law. Germany's laws around the display of Nazi symbols and insignia are among the strictest in the world. The law prohibits the use of symbols associated with organizations that the German government has declared unconstitutional, which includes the Nazi Party and the SS, except in specific contexts, educational purposes, journalism, research, or artistic works that are directed against the ideology those symbols represent. A background gag on a primetime animated comedy does not meet any of those exceptions. The intent was irrelevant. The uniform was there. The law did not negotiate with intent. Cape Fear was pulled from German broadcast. One of the great achievements of The Simpsons' entire run, an episode that secured Kelsey Grammer's position as one of the show's defining performers, and the rake sequence place in the history of comedic timing, was unavailable to an entire country for 14 years because of a background extra who was on screen for approximately 4 seconds. The episode eventually aired in Germany in 2007. The ban was not permanent, but 14 years is a long time. That is more than a decade of German Simpsons viewers being unable to watch Sideshow Bob step on 11 rakes in a row because an animator gave an announcer the wrong costume for a show that nobody in the episode actually watches. What the German ban reveals, more than anything else, is that the same image can carry entirely different weights in different places. An SS uniform in an American context in 1993 read, for most viewers, as a quick satirical jab at authoritarian aesthetics, the kind of visual shorthand that had been part of American comedy since at least the 1960s. Hogan's Heroes had been running in syndication for decades. The costume registered as a joke and nothing more. In Germany, it did not register as a joke. It registered as a symbol, Not because Germans lack a sense of humor about their history, which is a shallow and incorrect assumption, but because German law has a specific, considered, historically grounded reason for drawing the line where it draws it. The symbols of the Nazi regime are not neutral aesthetic objects in Germany. They are not available for casual deployment as background costuming. They carry a legal weight that reflects a national decision made after the Second World War about how a country recovers from having been the origin point of systematic genocide. That decision is not wrong, and it does not make the Simpsons writers wrong for using the uniform as a visual gag. It means that the same image performed two entirely different functions in two entirely different contexts, and that the law, correctly or not, only recognized one of them. For 14 years, Germany got the gap. Then, in 2007, they got the rakes. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The specific geography of the city of New York versus Homer Simpson matters more than it probably should, and the reason it matters is that the geography is precise. The writers knew where they were setting the episode. They were not using the World Trade Center as a vague New York symbol. They set Homer's car specifically between the Twin Towers because the Twin Towers are the specific location where you would plausibly get the most frustrating possible parking situation in Lower Manhattan. That specificity was a creative choice. The joke was about the towers, not about what they meant or what they symbolized or what they might one day come to represent. About the specific logistical difficulty of having your car clamped in the plaza between two of the largest buildings on the island. The World Trade Center was not built to be a symbol. It was built to be office space. The North Tower opened in 1972. The South Tower opened in 1973. Together they housed tens of thousands of workers, a subway station, a hotel, dozens of restaurants and retail shops, and the observation deck that tourists visited to look at Manhattan from above. They were enormous, and they were in Lower Manhattan, and they were part of the geography of the city in the way that any large building complex becomes part of the geography of a place after enough time. Background, infrastructure, just there. The Simpsons placed Homer's car in that geography in 1997 because it was just there. Because putting a car between two enormous office buildings in a tightly managed plaza and having the attendance booth be empty was a recognizable comedy of errors that New Yorkers who had ever dealt with Manhattan parking would understand immediately. The towers were the setting, not the point. After September 2001, the towers became only the point. They became the wound. They became the thing around which everything else in their vicinity was reorganized. And Homer, standing in the plaza, growing increasingly irritated, surrounded by the specific architecture of a place that no longer existed, became something it was not written to be. A memorial, a ghost story, a record of a world that was gone. The decision to pull the episode from broadcast was made out of sensitivity to the victims and their families, which is the only honest framing for it. It was not a legal decision or a moral one in the way that the Stark Raving Dad decision was moral. It was an acknowledgement that grief has a calendar and that some things cannot be broadcast during certain phases of that calendar without causing harm. The harm is not the content. The harm is the reminder arriving at the wrong moment of something that cannot be changed. The episode came back. The World Trade Center site became ground zero and then became a memorial and then became a construction site and then became One World Trade Center, which opened in November 2014 on the northwest corner of the original site, close to where the original complex stood. The North Tower's footprint itself is now the north reflecting pool of the September 11th memorial. The geography is rebuilt but utterly transformed, and Homer's car is still parked in the plaza in 1997 in a version of New York that existed then and does not exist now, in a comedy episode about a man who hates New York trying to navigate its bureaucracy. And when you watch it today, if you watch it today, you are watching both the comedy and the ghost at the same time. That is what the band left behind when it was lifted, not just the episode, the experience of watching it, the additional register that is there now whether you want it or not. Homer in the plaza, the towers behind him, and the specific date of the episode setting sitting in the corner of your awareness, reminding you that everything in the frame still existed in September of 1997 and that 4 years later, it did not. There is one more thing worth saying about the city of New York versus Homer Simpson that connects it to the longer arc of how The Simpsons has always operated in relation to New York City specifically. The show has always had a complicated relationship with New York. Springfield is not New York. It has never been New York. It is a composite of American small city life that borrows from many sources without being fully any of them. But the writers of The Simpsons have always been people with strong opinions about New York because the entertainment industry that produced them is centered there and in Los Angeles. And the tension between those two cities and the rest of the country is one of the defining cultural tensions in American life. Homer's hatred of New York in the episode is not random. It is an exaggerated version of a real cultural feeling, the suspicion and resentment that exists in much of the American interior toward the coastal cities that dominate national culture and political life. Homer has been to New York before, he had a bad time, and he has generalized that experience into a comprehensive rejection of everything the city represents. This is not a sympathetic portrayal of Homer's position. The episode makes clear that his attitude is provincially ridiculous, and that New York is, in fact, a genuinely extraordinary place. Marge and the children have a wonderful time. The city is depicted with affection and specificity. It is Homer who is wrong, not the city, but Homer's wrongness is rendered with enough humanity that you understand it. You have met people like Homer in their relationship to places they have decided they do not like. People who have a bad experience somewhere and convert that experience into a permanent judgment that no subsequent evidence can challenge. The episode is partly about that psychological rigidity, about the way Homer's certainty about New York prevents him from being able to see it clearly, and about how his family moves through the city with joy while he stays stuck in the plaza, waiting for the attendant to return. That character study still works. It worked in 1997, it worked when the episode returned to syndication, and it works now on Disney Plus with its content warning. Homer in the plaza is still funny. His fury at the parking situation is still recognizable. The comedy of errors still lands, the buildings are still gone. That is what the episode carries now that it did not carry in 1997. Not just the history of its ban, but the history of why it was banned, embedded in the background of every shot that includes the towers. You watch the episode now and you know, the knowledge does not prevent the comedy from working. The Simpsons has always been capable of holding comedy and sadness in the same frame. It is, at its deepest level, a show about a family that is always slightly on the edge of catastrophe, and always finding their way back to the couch. And the couch is always there, and the family is always there, and things always work out. And none of that prevents the specific sadness of knowing what the buildings in the background of a 1997 comedy episode eventually became. The episode is a good episode. It was worth bringing back. It is worth watching now. And it is also a documentary of a world that does not exist anymore. And it will always be both of those things at once, and that is fine. Art can hold more than one thing. The Simpsons has always known this. The 37 seasons that followed its premiere in December 1989 are full of moments that were, at the time of their creation, simply the next thing the writers wanted to do. A story they wanted to tell. A joke they thought was funny. A character moment that felt true. And then the world moved, and some of those moments became something else, became records of a time before something happened, or reflections of a cultural pressure that was building, or artifacts of an argument that was still ongoing. The show did not intend to make a documentary, it was trying to make a comedy. But comedies that engage with the real world become documents of it whether they intend to or not, and the documents accumulate. And the weight of the accumulation is what you feel when you sit with 37 seasons of this show and try to hold all of it at once. 803 episodes and counting. 37 seasons and continuing. A show that began before the internet and that will likely still be running when things we cannot currently imagine have already changed the world. It has outlived the cultural moments that produced many of its best episodes. It has survived the controversies that threatened to define it. It has buried one of its own most beloved installments and kept going. That is what endurance looks like from the inside, from within the show's own narrative. Watching season follow season with Homer still at the plant, and Bart still 10, and Lisa still trying, and Maggie still watching with those enormous eyes that take everything in and never let go of anything. The graveyard is part of the story. The gaps in the episode list are part of the story. And the show that created the graveyard and kept adding to it and kept going anyway is the most honest thing about it. You cannot make 37 seasons of television about a family and an American town without leaving a record of everything that happened while you were making it. The record includes the episodes that aired and the episodes that could not air, and the episodes that were pulled back after they aired, and the episodes that exist in only one format in an out-of-print physical media release that gets harder to find every year. All of it is the show. All of it is what The Simpsons is. The Cape Fear Band reveals something about Sideshow Bob that the show's writers understood instinctively but never stated directly, which is that Sideshow Bob is funny specifically because he takes himself so seriously. He is not funny because he is a villain who is also a bit silly. He is funny because he is a person of genuine intelligence, taste, and theatrical ambition who has directed all of that capacity toward the murder of a 10-year-old child. And the gap between the scope of his aspiration and the specificity of his target is where all the comedy lives. Kelsey Grammer understood this from the beginning. His performance as Sideshow Bob has never winked at the audience. He has always played the character with complete commitment to the internal logic of a man who genuinely believes that eliminating Bart Simpson is a worthy use of his considerable gifts. That commitment is what makes the rake sequence work at the level it works. Sideshow Bob stepping on 11 rakes is not funny because Sideshow Bob is a buffoon. It is funny because Sideshow Bob is clearly not a buffoon, and the rakes do not care. The rakes are indifferent to his dignity. And Sideshow Bob, who values his dignity above almost everything, must endure the indignity of the rakes while making his approach, and he does so with the pained resignation of a man who has decided that the mission is more important than the humiliation. By the 11th rake, you are laughing at something more than a slapstick gag. You are laughing at the collision between a man's self-image and reality's complete indifference to that self-image. You're laughing at the fact that 11 rakes did not stop him, that the 12th step after the 11th rake was still forward, still toward the boat, still toward Bart, that the absurdity did not deter him. He had a machete and a plan and a conviction, and the rakes were just a cost. Germany got the episode eventually. They got the rakes in 2007. The specific joke about the SS officer's uniform, the one that cost a country's viewers 14 years of access to one of the show's greatest achievements, is still in the episode when you watch it now. It is still there, 4 seconds of background costuming, an announcer in a uniform that an animator put on him as a quick visual gag in the mid-1990s. You might not notice it if you were not looking. You can understand, watching it now with the knowledge of the band, how something so small could have such a large consequence in a specific legal context. The gag was not changed. Germany did not require it to be edited. The episode aired eventually in full, with the uniform still on the announcer, which suggests that the German ban was not really about protecting its citizens from the image of the uniform, so much as it was about applying the law consistently during a period when the law did not have an exception for clearly comedic contexts. And eventually, enough time passed and enough regulatory context shifted that the episode could be shown without triggering that law's application. But the 14 years had already happened. The gap was already in the record. Cape Fear has 11 rakes and 14 years and 4 seconds of background costuming, and a man who should not be defeated by any of it. And is not. He is Sideshow Bob. He comes back. He always comes back. The episode that was banned in Germany came back too. Everything on this list came back eventually, except the one that was buried by the people who made it. And even that one is still there, in a 2003 DVD box set, in an episode list with a gap at the top, in the specific absence that a single scroll past Season 3 on Disney Plus will reveal if you know to look. The 4th episode on this list is not one that most casual Simpsons fans would name if you asked them to list controversial moments from the show's history. It does not feature a banned celebrity or a political symbol or a post-disaster sensitivity issue. It features the Simpson family going on vacation to South America. The episode is Season 13, Episode 15. It is called Blame It on Lisa. It aired on March 31st, 2002. And the country it depicts, Brazil, did not just complain. Brazil threatened to sue Fox. Let that settle for a moment. A nation's tourist board looked at a half-hour American cartoon and concluded that the legal system was the appropriate response. And the man who would later describe Stark Raving Dad as treasured, James L. Brooks, sat down and wrote a formal, public apology to an entire country on behalf of that cartoon. Not a statement, an apology, by name, to Brazil. The episode's premise is straightforward. Lisa has been sponsoring an orphan in Brazil through a charitable program. The orphan stops sending letters. Lisa is worried. She convinces the family to travel to Rio de Janeiro to investigate. The investigation proceeds. The orphan is eventually located. What happens in between is what caused the problem. The version of Rio de Janeiro that appears in Blame It on Lisa is one of the more unflattering depictions of a real city that The Simpsons ever produced. The streets are shown as dangerous and crime-ridden. Rats appear, large ones roaming freely. Homer is kidnapped by criminals and held for ransom in a scene played primarily for comedy. The local men are depicted in ways that the Brazilian government characterized as stereotyped. The local women are depicted in ways that the Brazilian government also characterized as stereotyped. The entire city is rendered through the Simpsons' lens as a place that is colorful and vibrant and also extremely likely to rob, abduct, or bite you. Brazil's tourism board was not amused. This was not a private complaint. The tourism board went public with its objections and stated that the episode had the potential to undermine years of work promoting Brazil as an international travel destination. They characterized the depiction as defamatory. They raised the possibility of legal action against Fox. The showrunner at the time, James L. Brooks, issued a formal apology. He apologized to Brazil. Specifically, not a vague corporate "we regret any offense" statement. An apology to a country for what his show had done to its reputation. The episode was eventually released again in 2002, accompanied by a disclaimer about the accurate portrayal of Rio de Janeiro and the Brazilian people. The disclaimer was the public record of a production company acknowledging that it had gotten something wrong, even if the something was a cartoon rat in a cartoon street that was never intended to represent anyone's actual city. The Simpsons has done episodes set in Japan, China, France, England, Australia, Mexico, and numerous other countries over its 37-year run. Almost none of those episodes required an apology from its executive producer. Almost none of them produced a threat of legal action from a national government body. The Brazil episode was different. The question worth sitting with is why? Part of the answer is probably that the depiction in Blame It on Lisa was more sustained than most of the show's international jokes. It was not a quick visual gag or a single throwaway line. It was an entire episode set in a specific city, depicting that city over 20 minutes, in ways that a person who lives there might find genuinely hurtful. The show has always been satirical about America. It has always been willing to make Americans look stupid and corrupt and provincial and foolish. Homer, after all, is the show's center of gravity, and Homer's not exactly a flattering portrait of American manhood. But there is a difference between satirizing your own culture from the inside and depicting someone else's from the outside. The Simpsons was very good at the first thing and not always careful about the second. The apology was real. The disclaimer ran. The episode exists. And somewhere in an office building in Rio de Janeiro, there is a file in which a tourism board once decided that a cartoon needed to be held accountable, and then was. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The 5th episode on this list was banned in 2 countries for 2 entirely different reasons, which is an achievement of sorts. It managed to be offensive in Japan for what it depicted about Japanese culture and offensive in South Korea for what it depicted about Japan's relationship with South Korean history. The Simpsons has been many things over its 37 seasons, but rarely has a single episode managed to land on the wrong side of a regional geopolitical tension while simultaneously making enemies of a third party through an entirely separate cultural misstep. 30 Minutes Over Tokyo is Season 10, Episode 23 of The Simpsons. It aired on May 16, 1999. The Simpson family travels to Japan after Homer discovers extreme frugality as a cost-cutting lifestyle, amassing enough savings for plane tickets through aggressive couponing and dumpster diving. The episode proceeds through a series of Japan-set jokes and observations about cultural differences, before concluding with the family being forced to participate in a dangerous Japanese game show to earn their tickets home. The episode is not one of the stronger entries from Season 10. It has moments that work, but it also has moments that, when viewed from the perspective of their Japanese audience, range from mildly tone-deaf to genuinely upsetting. The Hello Kitty factory joke is one of them. The episode implies, in the way that Simpsons' visual gags often imply things quickly without dwelling on them, that Hello Kitty products are manufactured through a process that involves burning actual cats. Hello Kitty is not a minor piece of pop culture in Japan. It is a multi-billion-dollar franchise with deep emotional resonance for multiple generations of Japanese consumers. The joke registered in Japan as something more aggressive than the Simpsons writers likely intended. But the moment that mattered most, the one that sits differently from everything else in the episode, involves the anime parody that appears on Japanese television in the show. The program is called Battling Seizure Robots. The name is not an accident. The episode is referencing something specific, something that had happened less than 2 years before it aired. On December 16, 1997, an episode of the Pokémon animated series called Electric Soldier Porygon broadcast in Japan. During the episode, there was a sequence that used rapidly alternating red and blue flashes of light at high frequency. The result was catastrophic. Approximately 685 children in Japan experienced photosensitive epileptic seizures while watching the broadcast. Hundreds were hospitalized. The episode was immediately pulled from circulation globally and has never been broadcast again. Electric Soldier Porygon has not aired anywhere in the world since December 1997. The children who were hospitalized are adults now, and the episode remains, to this day, the most significant broadcast-induced mass seizure event in television history. Battling Seizure Robots in the 30 Minutes Over Tokyo episode of The Simpsons deployed that event as a punchline approximately 18 months after it happened. In Japan, a country where hundreds of children had been physically harmed by exactly the phenomenon the joke referenced, the punchline did not land as satire. It landed as mockery. It landed as a powerful American entertainment company making a joke about an incident that had sent children to hospitals across the country. Japan banned the episode. South Korea initially banned the episode as well, though for a different reason, related to the episode's depiction of Japan in ways that touched historical tensions between the two countries that run far deeper than anything a cartoon was equipped to navigate. South Korea eventually aired the episode in 2007. Japan did not. 30 Minutes Over. Tokyo remains unavailable on Disney Plus Japan. The episode that made a comedy out of the most serious broadcast safety incident in television history has never officially aired in the country where that incident occurred. There is something worth acknowledging here about the gap between intentions and consequences. The writers of 30 Minutes Over Tokyo almost certainly did not sit in a room and decide to mock the suffering of Japanese children. The joke was almost certainly meant as a quick, satirical jab at the absurdity of the Pokémon seizure incident as a media story, the way American news had covered it with a certain fascinated bemusement. It was the kind of gag that, from a distance, in a writer's room in Los Angeles, might have seemed simply edgy, a little transgressive, the kind of thing The Simpsons was supposed to do. The distance from Los Angeles to Tokyo is 5,478 miles. That distance does not close itself to accommodate intent. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The other detail about 30 Minutes Over Tokyo that does not get discussed as often as the seizure robot gag is the scene involving the Japanese emperor. In the episode, Homer throws the Emperor of Japan into a box of sumo thongs. The Emperor of Japan is, constitutionally and culturally, a figure of profound reverence in Japanese society. The imperial family occupies a position in Japanese public life that has no precise equivalent in American culture. The closest comparison might be the British royal family. But even that undersells the specific weight the emperor carries in Japan's national identity and its post-war recovery narrative. Homer throwing him into a box of sumo thongs is the kind of joke that from a certain angle is just Homer being Homer. Homer does not understand reverence. Homer does not operate with the awareness that some things are not available for physical comedy. This is, in many ways, the entire premise of Homer Simpson as a character. He is a force of accidental disrespect. He does not mean harm, he just does not know that the harm is available. That explanation does not do much work in a country where the figure being thrown into a box is your emperor. The combination of the Hello Kitty factory implication, the Battling Seizure Robots punchline, and the Emperor gag produced in Japan, an episode that felt less like satire and more like a list of things that an outside culture had decided were available for mockery. The ban was not a nervous overreaction, it was a country drawing a line. The episode still does not exist on Japanese streaming platforms, and the children who were hospitalized in December 1997 have grown up in a country where the cartoon that made a joke about what happened to them never officially aired. The Blame It on Lisa apology is worth spending more time with than it usually gets, because what James L. Brooks did was unusual in a way that goes beyond the specific controversy. Television producers do not typically write formal apologies to countries. The machinery of broadcast entertainment is not built for that kind of accountability. When shows receive complaints from governments or cultural organizations, the standard response is a press statement expressing commitment to diversity and a regret for any offense taken, which is a formulation that manages to apologize for the audience's reaction without conceding anything about the content itself. Brooks did something different. He acknowledged specifically that the depiction of Rio de Janeiro was unfair. He did not say that the episode was misunderstood or that Brazilian viewers were applying too rigid a standard to comedy. He said in effect that the show had gotten it wrong, and he wrote that to Brazil. He put it on the record. What is interesting about this, in the context of everything else The Simpsons has produced over 37 seasons, is that it happened at all. The show has depicted American cities with far less flattery than it depicted Rio. Springfield itself is a running portrait of a place where the water is probably contaminated. The local officials are comprehensively corrupt, and the dominant institutions are either actively harmful or simply non-functional. The show has never apologized for what it did to Springfield, because Springfield is a fictional stand-in for the aspects of American life that the show's writers wanted to criticize from the inside. The difference with Rio is that Rio is real, and the people who live there are real, and the tourism board, whatever you think of tourism boards as an institution, was representing a real community that had watched an American cartoon depict their city as a place of rats and crime and kidnapping and not much else, and had concluded that the depiction was damaging. The legal threat reflected a legal system's assessment of what harm looks like when it comes from a television show. The apology reflected a producer's personal conclusion that the legal threat was correct. That sequence of events, the threat, the apology, the disclaimer, is a small piece of the larger story of how entertainment media reckon with the consequences of depicting real places and real people with insufficient care. Blame It on Lisa is not a uniquely careless episode of The Simpsons. The show has been careless in various ways throughout its run. But Brazil pushed back hard enough, and credibly enough, that the carelessness had to be acknowledged. And Brooks was the one who did it. The same man who buried Stark raving dad because he believed it was the right thing to do sat down and wrote an apology to Brazil because he believed that was the right thing to do. He is, by the pattern of his decisions, a person who tries to do the right thing when the right thing becomes clear to him. The right thing is not always clear immediately. It becomes clear when the evidence accumulates. For Blame It on Lisa, the evidence was a national tourism board threatening a lawsuit and the specific, visible hurt of a community that had watched itself depicted as a place no one would want to visit. For Stark Raving Dad, the evidence was 4 hours of documentary testimony that he found convincing and heartbreaking. Different evidence, same response, the willingness to lose something in order to be accountable for it. Brazil got the disclaimer, the episode is still in circulation. The disclaimer is still there when it airs. It is a small addition to the record, a sentence acknowledging what the episode did not do accurately, appended to an episode that keeps airing with that acknowledgement attached. The apology is part of the episode now. You cannot watch Blame It on Lisa without knowing that James L. Brooks wrote a letter to Brazil. That is what the episode is, partly. A piece of television about a family trip to South America, and a formal acknowledgement by its producer that the trip could have been written more carefully. The battling seizure robots gag in 30 Minutes Over Tokyo operates on a specific logic that is worth unpacking, because it reflects a particular mode of Simpsons comedy that was extremely common in the show's run, and that occasionally produced this kind of consequence. The show, especially in its middle seasons, had a habit of converting ongoing media stories into visual gags without fully calculating what those media stories meant to the people most directly involved in them. The Pokemon seizure incident had been, in American media, a story about the weirdness of anime. That is the uncomfortable truth of how it was reported in the United States. The framing in American news coverage of the 1997 event was often one of bemused distance, the kind of coverage that describes something alarming in a foreign country with the implicit comfort of knowing it is not your country. Hundreds of Japanese children were hospitalized by a cartoon. Was not that odd? Was not that a strange story? There is something alarming about how cartoons work in Japan, the coverage suggested, or perhaps about how Japan works in general. The Simpsons writers, working in Los Angeles, absorbed that framing. Their reference to the incident in battling seizure robots reflects the version of the story that American media had told, which was, a cartoon caused seizures in Japan, which is weird and dark and available for comedy. What that framing did not include was the experience of the children who were in the hospital, the parents who had been watching with them, the other viewers who had experienced symptoms but did not require hospitalization, the families whose children had long-term consequences, the specific human cost of what happened on December 16, 1997, which was not a strange cultural artifact but a mass harm event that affected real people. The joke treated the incident as a media story. In Japan, it was not a media story. It was something that happened to people. This gap between a story as it is reported in one place and a story as it is lived in another is at the core of several bans on this list. The Simpsons was not a show without empathy. It was a show that operated primarily from within American cultural assumptions, and those assumptions occasionally produced a version of events that was accurate to how the events had been reported and completely inadequate to how the events had been experienced. Japan did not get to decide which version of the story was the right one to satirize, but Japan did get to decide not to broadcast the episode. The Electric Soldier Porygon episode of Pokémon, the one that caused the seizures, has never aired anywhere again since December 16, 1997. Its existence is acknowledged in episode guides and wikis and historical records, but it is not available on any streaming platform, in any country, in any format. It is the stark raving dad of Pokémon, present in the record, accessible only through the specific physical media issued before the decision to withdraw it, and absent from every official channel since. The Simpsons made a joke about the thing that caused the Pokémon episode to be permanently withdrawn. Japan, understandably, withdrew the Simpsons episode in response. The symmetry is imperfect and the situations are not equivalent, but there is something in it that reflects how cultural memory works. The wound was still recent, the episode landed in it, Japan drew the line. The rest of the 30 Minutes Over Tokyo episode is, in Japan, simply unavailable. The other jokes, the Hello Kitty gag, the game show ending, the general comedic portrait of Homer Simpson failing to understand a foreign culture, none of it gets to air in the country it is set in. The whole episode is excluded because some of its parts were too specific in the wrong way. That is how content restrictions often work. They are not surgical, they remove the whole piece rather than the offending section, and in doing so, they also remove everything around the offending section, including the parts that might have been perfectly acceptable. Japan never got the parts that might have been fine. Japan never got the game show. They got the gap. The 6th episode on this list is one of the most critically praised episodes from the show's 9th season. It tackles one of the most politically charged subjects in American public life. It does so with enough fairness, enough genuine engagement with both sides of the argument that viewers who support gun ownership and viewers who oppose it have both cited it over the years as a depiction of their position that felt honest. It is not propaganda. It is not a polemic. It is a story about Homer Simpson getting something he should absolutely not have, and what happens when the family has to live with that decision. The Cartridge Family is Season 9, Episode 5 of The Simpsons. It aired on November 2nd, 1997. The United Kingdom banned it. In certain regions, the ban held until 2005. The episode begins with a soccer riot in Springfield that leaves the town feeling unsafe. Homer decides to buy a gun for home protection. Marge objects from the moment he brings it home. Homer is irresponsible with it in virtually every way imaginable. He points it at things he should not point it at. He holsters it inside his pants, which goes as well as you would expect. He uses it to change the channel on the television. He brings it to a family dinner and treats it with the same casual carelessness he brings to everything else in his life. Marge reaches the end of her patience and gives Homer an ultimatum. The gun or the family? Homer chooses the family. The gun is gone. The episode ends with the Simpsons driving away, and it is revealed that Homer has tucked the gun into the back of his waistband, still unable to fully let go. It is a good ending. It is honest. It does not resolve the tension cleanly, because the tension is not clean. Homer giving up the gun because Marge demanded it is not the same as Homer understanding why he should not have had it. The episode respects that distinction. Britain did not see this for years. The UK's ban was rooted in its gun control framework, which is among the strictest in the developed world. Following the Dunblane massacre in March 1996, in which a gunman killed 16 children and one teacher at a primary school in Scotland, Britain tightened its already strict gun laws significantly. Handguns were effectively banned for private ownership. The culture around firearms shifted in ways that went beyond legislation. The casual American relationship with gun ownership, the kind that the Cartridge family depicted, in which Homer buys a handgun with relatively little impediment and then behaves recklessly with it for comedic effect, was not something British broadcasters in 1997 were prepared to put on primetime television. The irony is that the episode largely argues against what the UK was afraid of. The Cartridge family does not glorify Homer's gun ownership. It depicts it as dangerous and silly and slightly terrifying. Marge's position is presented as reasonable and correct. The ending, with Homer hiding the gun in his waistband as the car pulls away, is not a celebration of the Second Amendment. It is a portrait of exactly the kind of person who probably should not own a firearm, which is to say, a person who thinks having a firearm would be fun. None of that mattered to the UK's broadcasters in the years immediately following Dunblane. The image of Homer Simpson pointing a gun at a television set and laughing was not something they could put in front of an audience that had buried 16 5-year-olds the previous year. The ban was eventually lifted. The episode now airs in Britain, and Homer's gun is still in his waistband at the end. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The 7th episode on this list covers a topic that, in the years since the episode aired in 2002, has become substantially less controversial in most Western countries. Medical marijuana has been legal in an increasing number of American states since the mid-2000s, and recreational marijuana is now legal in many more. The subject has moved from the outer edge of acceptable television content towards something close to the center. But in 2002, when Weekend at Bernie's aired, it was still sufficiently transgressive that it triggered restrictions in multiple countries. Weekend at Bernie's is season 13, episode 16 of The Simpsons. It aired on April 7th, 2002. Homer is attacked by a flock of crows early in the episode, sustaining injuries to his eyes. His doctor, responding to Homer's complaints about eye pain, prescribes medical marijuana. Homer discovers that he enjoys the experience, becomes increasingly enthusiastic about it, and becomes, in his characteristic way, a rather public and undiscriminating advocate for his new medication. The episode is actually quite funny, and it handles the subject with the kind of deadpan matter-of-factness that The Simpsons does well when it chooses to. Homer's new disposition under medical marijuana makes him briefly a better employee and a calmer person, which says something about Homer that the show is willing to acknowledge without dwelling on. When the marijuana is recriminalized and Homer is abruptly cut off, his withdrawal is depicted with the same cheerful exaggeration as everything else in his life. The United Kingdom banned the episode from pre-watershed broadcast. In British broadcasting, the watershed is 9 p.m., the time after which more adult content is permitted. Restricting Weekend at Bernie's to post-watershed meant it could not air in the early evening slots where The Simpsons typically lives. Australia gave it an M rating. The United States eventually upgraded it to TV-14. These are not bans in the absolute sense that the German ban on Cape Fear was, or the complete removal of Stark Raving Dad from all distribution, but they are restrictions, and they reflect the moment the episode was made. The world has moved, the episode has not. And what was once transgressive enough to shift time slots in Britain is now, in most of the English-speaking world, unremarkable. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The 8th episode on this list touches on something that is not, in China, a comedy subject. That is not a judgment. That is simply the fact we are working with. The event that the episode references is, within China's official public discourse, not acknowledged to have happened in the way that historians have documented it. The Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989 is, in China, a subject so sensitive that the government actively suppresses discussion of it, removes references to it from the internet, and has, in some cases, prosecuted people for publicly commemorating its victims. The Simpsons, in Season 16, Episode 12, made a joke about it. Goo Goo Gai Pan aired on March 13, 2005. Selma Bouvier, Marge's sister, learns that she is going through early menopause. She becomes desperate to raise a child of her own before the window closes. The family travels to China for Selma to adopt a baby, since China's adoption requirements at the time specified that only married couples could adopt. Homer agrees to pose as Selma's husband for the duration of the process. The episode passes through Tiananmen Square. In the shot, there is a tank. The episode uses the image directly and without softening it. It makes a specific reference to the massacre, to what happened in that square in June of 1989, when the Chinese government used military force to suppress a pro-democracy protest, killing hundreds and possibly thousands of people, with the full death toll never officially confirmed by the Chinese government and actively disputed to this day. Homer, being Homer, does not really understand what he is looking at. He reads a placard describing the square and reacts to the massacre reference with the obtuse confusion he brings to most historical information. This is the joke. The joke is Homer's ignorance. The joke is the gap between the gravity of what the placard describes and the complete blankness of Homer's response to it. In China, the joke is not available, because in China, the placard does not exist. The official position is that the event described on the placard did not happen in the way that outside sources claim. Acknowledging the placard, even through Homer's obtuse cartoon ignorance, means acknowledging the thing the placard describes. China banned all foreign cartoons from popular viewing hours for children in 2006, 1 year after Goo Goo Gai Pan aired. The ban was framed as a broad cultural policy, but when Disney Plus launched in China in 2021, with The Simpsons available as part of the catalog, viewers noticed something specific. Episode 12 of Season 16 was not there. In Hong Kong, which launched its own Disney Plus service in the same period, the episode was also absent. The Tiananmen Square reference is what is not allowed, not the adoption storyline, not Selma's menopause, not Homer pretending to be someone's husband while understanding approximately nothing about the country he is visiting. The tank is what is not allowed. The acknowledgement that something happened in that square is what is not allowed. There are currently an estimated 1.4 billion people in China. None of them can watch this episode on any official platform. Not because the episode is offensive to Chinese culture in a general sense, because the episode acknowledges, even through Homer's cartoon ignorance, that something occurred in 1989 that the government has decided its citizens should not be able to encounter. The ban is not about the quality of the episode. The ban is about the presence of a fact. That is the distinction that separates Goo Goo Gai Pan from most of the other episodes on this list. The Brazilian ban was about image and reputation. The German ban was about legal frameworks around specific symbols. The Japanese ban was about cultural sensitivity and a specific historical trauma. Those bans reflect governments and broadcast standards bodies making judgments about what their audiences should be protected from, for reasons that range from the legally precise to the emotionally understandable. The Chinese ban is different. The Chinese ban is about information control. The Chinese ban is not about protecting the audience from something upsetting. It is about maintaining a version of the past that the government prefers and ensuring that nothing contradicts that version, not even a cartoon in which Homer Simpson reads a sign and does not understand what it says. The episode exists on Disney Plus everywhere in the world except China and Hong Kong. It is precisely 22 minutes of animated television. It is not a political documentary. It is not a human rights report. It is an episode of The Simpsons in which Selma Bouvier adopts a baby. And it is not allowed in China because somewhere in those 22 minutes there is a tank. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Cartridge Family is one of the most structurally honest episodes The Simpsons produced about American gun culture. And that honesty is precisely what made it complicated to broadcast in a country that had just lived through Dunblane. The episode does not pretend that Homer's gun ownership is simply dangerous. It also does not pretend that his desire for the gun is irrational. It shows both things at once, the reasonableness of wanting to feel protected and the specific danger of Homer Simpson being the person doing the protecting, and it lets both of those things be true simultaneously without resolving the tension between them. That is sophisticated television. It is the kind of complexity that The Simpsons achieved fairly regularly during its golden era. The show was willing to let difficult things be difficult rather than flattening them into moral certainties. And in a country where the legal and cultural context around firearms was radically different from the American one, that complexity did not translate. The UK did not need a nuanced fictional portrait of an irresponsible gun owner to meditate on. The UK needed, in the period immediately following Dunblane, to not see Homer Simpson pointing a gun at a television for laughs on primetime television. The Dunblane massacre happened on March 13, 1996. Thomas Hamilton entered Dunblane Primary School in Dunblane near Stirling, Scotland, and shot and killed 16 children aged 5 and 6, along with their teacher. He then killed himself. It remains the deadliest mass shooting in British history. The United Kingdom passed the Firearms Act of 1997 in the aftermath, effectively banning private ownership of handguns. The law passed with overwhelming political support. The cultural shift around firearms in Britain after Dunblane was not simply legal, it was atmospheric. The presence of handguns in public life, even fictional public life, even cartoon public life, became something that a substantial portion of the British public did not want to encounter in entertainment contexts. Homer Simpson buying a handgun and carrying it irresponsibly through Springfield is, from an American perspective, a comedy of errors with moral overtones. From a British perspective in 1997, it was a piece of entertainment built around an object that had recently killed 16 5-year-olds in a primary school. The comedy of errors frame did not remove the gun from the story. Homer's irresponsibility did not defang the weapon. The gun was still there. And for a country that had just buried 16 children, the gun being there was enough. The Cartridge Family eventually aired in Britain. The ban lifted, the episode is available now, Homer's gun is still in his waistband at the end. The specific context that made broadcasting it impossible in 1997 has not disappeared, but it has aged into a different shape. The episode can now be seen as a historical artifact, a record of a particular moment in the ongoing American conversation about firearms, and that record is available to British audiences in a way that it was not in the years immediately following Dunblane. The episode is good, it is worth watching, it does what The Simpsons does at its best, which is use a specific domestic situation to illuminate something real about the culture it is examining. Homer's relationship with the gun is a portrait of a specific American psychology. The belief that owning a weapon is primarily an act of self-empowerment rather than a calculated risk, and that belief is depicted with the affectionate but unflinching accuracy that the show brought to its best character studies. Britain got the episode eventually. What they missed was the specific moment when the episode would have been most immediately relevant to the cultural conversation they were having. By the time it aired, the conversation had moved. The episode was still the same, the context had shifted enough that it could be received as comedy again rather than as an intrusion. That is probably what had to happen. That is probably the only version in which the episode could have aired in Britain without causing harm. But something is lost when the right moment for a piece of art has passed before the piece of art arrives. What makes Weekend at Burnsies genuinely interesting, beyond the marijuana content that triggered the broadcast restrictions, is what it reveals about Homer Simpson when one of his characteristic behavioral patterns is chemically modified. Homer, under the influence of medical marijuana, is for a brief period a more functional person. He is calmer, he is less reactive, his relationships with his coworkers improve. His relationship with his family briefly improves. Mr. Burns notices that Homer's performance at the plant has gotten better, not worse. Homer stoned is doing better at work than Homer sober, which says something about the specific nature of Homer's dysfunction that the show is willing to acknowledge through comedic indirection. This is the kind of observation that The Simpsons at its best was capable of, the kind of thing that works as a joke and also as a portrait of something real. Homer's chronic failure is not a character flaw in the conventional sense. It is not laziness or bad intentions or moral weakness. It is a specific cognitive and emotional pattern that makes sustained attention and modulated response genuinely difficult for him. The marijuana interrupted that pattern temporarily, And when it was gone, the pattern returned, and Homer returned to being who he has always been. The episode is not an argument for medical marijuana. It does not conclude that Homer's brief improvement represents a solution to anything. It is much more honest than that. Homer's improvement under the medication was real while it lasted and meaningless once the medication was unavailable. The lesson is not that Homer should stay on marijuana. The lesson is that Homer is who Homer is, and the medication was a window, not a door. That complexity is not what got the episode restricted in Britain and rated M in Australia. What got it restricted was the casual, extended, sympathetic depiction of an adult male enjoying the effects of a controlled substance over the course of a primetime animated comedy. In 2002, in the regulatory frameworks of several countries, that depiction was not available for pre-watershed broadcast, regardless of how the episode handled it narratively. The world has moved considerably since 2002 on this specific subject. Medical marijuana is now legal in most American states. Recreational marijuana is legal in many of them. Canada legalized recreational marijuana nationally in 2018. Several European countries have decriminalized or partially legalized it. The regulatory anxiety that positioned Weekend at Burnsies as too strong for pre-watershed British television now reads, from the vantage point of the mid-2020s, as a document of a moment that has largely passed. But it was real while it was happening, and the episode, as a piece of television, is a better artifact of that moment for having been restricted. It tells you something about 2002 that you would not know, as precisely if the episode had simply aired without incident. Now, for the Goo Goo Gai Pan episode and the China situation, there is an additional dimension to the ban that is worth examining, and it connects to something larger than the specific Tiananmen Square reference. When Disney Plus launched in China in November 2021, the launch itself was a significant event in the global streaming landscape. Disney was entering one of the world's largest potential entertainment markets, bringing with it one of the most extensive libraries of American television and film ever assembled. The Simpsons, all 30-plus completed seasons of it, was part of that library. Disney Plus China users found the show in the catalog and began watching it. And then someone noticed that season 16 skipped from episode 11 to episode 13. Episode 12 was simply not there. The notice spread. English language media in particular covered it, because the reason was not subtle to anyone paying attention to Chinese censorship patterns. Goo Goo Gai Pan contains a Tiananmen Square reference. Disney Plus China did not carry Goo Goo Gai Pan. The math was straightforward. What made the story significant beyond the specific episode is what it illustrated about the terms on which American entertainment companies operate in China. Disney did not fight the ban. Disney did not issue a statement defending the episode's content or explaining why an American animated comedy's reference to a historical event should be available to Chinese viewers. Disney quietly carried a library in which episode 12 of season 16 did not exist in China, and moved on to the business of operating in the largest entertainment market in the world under the terms that market requires. This is not a criticism of Disney specifically. Every major American entertainment company operating in China navigates similar constraints. The constraints are not negotiable. The alternative to accepting them is not operating in China at all, which is its own commercial calculation. But the result is that 1.4 billion people have access to Disney Plus content with specific gaps in it. Gaps that correspond to things the Chinese government has decided its citizens should not encounter, and those gaps are maintained by the American companies that built the platforms. Goo Goo Gai Pan is one of those gaps. Homer's obtuse cartoon ignorance in the face of a Tiananmen Square marker is not available to anyone in China through any official channel. The tank is not available. The acknowledgement is not available. The fact is not available. The 9th episode on this list was one of only 2 episodes in the show's entire history to never air in Japan. Not restricted, not post-watershed, not edited, never broadcast there, not once. It joins 30 Minutes Over Tokyo in that distinction, and the 2 episodes sit in that category for reasons that are completely separate from each other, which says something about how many different ways The Simpsons managed to land on the wrong side of Japanese sensibility over the course of its run. Little Big Mom is season 11, episode 5 of The Simpsons. It aired on January 9th, 2000. Marge breaks her leg during a family ski trip and is hospitalized, leaving Lisa to manage the household in her absence. Homer and Bart ignore every instruction Lisa gives them and refuse to pull their weight on any domestic responsibility. Lisa, at the end of her patience, tries a different approach. She convinces Homer and Bart that they have contracted leprosy. She accomplishes this with a combination of oatmeal and green paint applied to their skin, which she presents to them as the visual evidence of their infection. Homer and Bart, alarmed, become instantly cooperative. The leprosy subplot is played entirely for comedy. Lisa's deception is the joke. Homer and Bart's terror is the punchline. The disease is a tool in a domestic sitcom storyline about a 10-year-old girl trying to get her father and brother to do their dishes. Japan banned the episode. It has never aired there. It is not available on Disney Plus Japan. The reason requires some historical context that does not appear anywhere in the episode itself because the episode was not written with that context in mind. It was written in Los Angeles in 1999 by writers who were primarily thinking about the comedic mechanics of Lisa's deception rather than the specific weight that leprosy carried in the country where the episode would eventually not be broadcast. Japan's history with leprosy, specifically with Hansen's disease, which is the medical term for the bacterial infection commonly called leprosy, is unlike the history of almost any other country. From 1907 onward, Japan operated a series of national sanatoriums specifically designated for people diagnosed with Hansen's disease. Patients were not admitted voluntarily. They were forcibly removed from their communities and placed in state institutions, separated from their families, isolated from society. The policy continued for decades. In some of these institutions, forced sterilization was performed on patients to prevent the propagation of the disease. Children born to patients were sometimes taken from their parents at birth. This policy was not the result of ignorance about transmission. By the mid-20th century, the scientific understanding of Hansen's disease was clear enough that the justifications for forced isolation were medical myths rather than medical facts. The policy persisted anyway because the stigma surrounding the disease had become institutional, embedded in law, and the law did not change until 1996. Japan's leprosy prevention law was repealed in 1996. 40 years after the scientific and medical community had reached a consensus that the isolation policy was both unnecessary and cruel, the law was still in effect. The Japanese government formally apologized to survivors of the sanatorium system in 1996, the same year the law was repealed. Little Big Mom aired in January 2000, 4 years after the apology, 1 year after the United States had already broadcast it. The gap between the context in which the episode was written and the context in which it was received in Japan is not subtle. The writers were deploying leprosy as a comedic shorthand, using the word the same way that many American comedy writers had used it for decades, as a vaguely ridiculous-sounding disease that connotes medieval fear and physical grotesqueness without referencing any specific living experience. In Japan, the word was not vaguely ridiculous. It was connected directly and painfully and very recently, and to a legal system that had destroyed the lives of thousands of people who were still alive and dealing with the consequences. The episode was not a commentary on Japan. It was not trying to engage with Japan's history at all, but the joke required a context that Japan did not have, and it produced a reaction that the American writers did not anticipate, because the distance between Los Angeles and Tokyo is more than miles. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The 10th episode on this list is banned in Russia. The reason involves a Pokemon Go parody, an Orthodox church, and a blogger who was convicted of a criminal offense for doing something that the episode depicts Homer doing for fun. Looking for Mr. Goodbart is Season 28, Episode 20 of The Simpsons. It aired on April 30th, 2017. In the episode, Homer becomes obsessed with a mobile game called Pokemon Get, which is an explicit parody of Pokemon Go, the augmented reality location-based game that became a global phenomenon in the summer of 2016. In his pursuit of in-game creatures, Homer visits various locations around Springfield, including a church. He plays the game inside the church without particular awareness or concern about the inappropriateness of doing so. This is consistent with Homer's character in a general sense. Homer does not register most categories of transgression. In Russia, this was not a comedy situation. In 2016, a Russian blogger named Ruslan Sokolovsky recorded himself playing Pokemon Go inside a cathedral in Yekaterinburg. He posted the video online. He was arrested. He was charged under Russian law with offending religious believers and inciting hatred, charges that carry serious penalties under statutes that were strengthened during the 2000s as part of a broader legal expansion of protections for religious sentiment in Russia. Sokolovsky was convicted. The case was internationally covered and widely criticized by press freedom organizations. The episode of The Simpsons aired on April 30th, 2017, just 11 days before Sokolovsky's conviction was finalized on May 11th, 2017. Russian Orthodox Church officials and associated commentators condemned the episode for what they described as mocking faith. The Russian cable channel 2x2 refused to air it around the time of Sokolovsky's conviction. The ban was framed specifically in terms of the episode's disrespect toward religious spaces and the broader social harm of normalizing behavior that Russia had, through Sokolovsky's prosecution, explicitly criminalized. Homer playing Pokemon Get in a cartoon church is not the same thing as a Russian blogger playing Pokemon Go in a real cathedral. Homer is not aware of the religious significance of the space he is in, but Homer is also a cartoon character whose awareness has never been the point. The show was not making a statement about the Russian Orthodox Church. It was making a statement about how thoroughly Pokemon Go consumed people's attention in 2016, to the point where they played it everywhere without thinking about where everywhere included. Russia did not draw that distinction. In a country where the legal system had recently established that playing a location-based mobile game in a church was a prosecutable act of religious hatred, an American cartoon depicting a character doing the same thing for laughs was not available for broadcast. The ban on looking for Mr. Goodbart reflects something specific about how the cultural and political context in Russia had shifted during the 2000s and 10s, and about how a joke that would read, in most Western contexts, as mild observational comedy about the Pokemon Go craze of 2016 could read, in a different legal and cultural framework, as something the state decided it could not permit. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The 11th and final episode on this list is the most recent. It is also the most mysterious. A Maid Maggie is Season 33, Episode 10 of The Simpsons. It aired on December 19th, 2021. The episode is, by most accounts, a reasonably charming installment in the show's later run. Homer and Marge have decided that baby Maggie should be baptized. The search for an appropriate godfather leads them, through a series of circumstances, to Fat Tony, Springfield's resident mob boss. Fat Tony accepts the responsibility of godparenthood with more sincerity than you might expect. Maggie, in her characteristic silent way, begins gradually assimilating into the rhythms of organized crime, finding in the mob's world of loyalty and hierarchy something that appeals to her. The episode leans into its godfather references with affection, delivers its jokes about Maggie and the mob with good timing, and is, on any objective assessment, a perfectly fine episode of The Simpsons. The Czech Republic banned it. They have not said why. This is the full extent of the official explanation. A Maid Maggie was banned in the Czech Republic. No public statement was issued explaining the ban. No government body explained its reasoning. No broadcast organization released a statement about which element of the episode's content was deemed unacceptable or which regulation had been invoked to justify its removal. The Czech Republic looked at this episode and said no, and then said nothing else. Various commentators have speculated. The organized crime content seems like the obvious candidate, given that the episode revolves around the Simpsons making a mob boss the godfather of their youngest child, and given that concerns about the glorification of organized crime have occasionally animated content restrictions in various European countries. But that is speculation. Nobody knows. The Czech Republic has not explained itself. There is something in this that is almost perfectly Simpsons in its quality. The show has produced 37 seasons of content, navigating controversies and bans and diplomatic incidents and formal apologies and legal threats. And at the end of the list, after all of the clearly articulated reasons and documented political pressures and specific cultural sensitivities, there is this. An episode about Maggie being baptized in a country that will not tell you why it refused to air it. The absence of a reason is its own kind of statement. Every other episode on this list was banned with a rationale, a symbol, a historical wound. a government's relationship to its own past, a lawsuit, an apology, a moral conviction that came from inside the building. The Czech Republic simply drew a line and did not explain where it came from or what it was protecting. The show keeps going. The list keeps growing, and Maggie, in Prague, remains unbaptized. The Japan of 2000, when Little Big Mom aired in the United States, was a country that had issued a formal apology to the survivors of the Hansen's disease sanatorium system only 4 years earlier. 4 years is very recent. In cultural terms, 4 years after a formal government apology for decades of forced institutionalization and forced sterilization is not long enough for the word that described the disease to become available as a comedic prop in someone else's domestic sitcom storyline. The people who survived Japan's sanatorium system were still alive in 2000. Some of them were still living in those institutions because even after the leprosy prevention law was repealed in 1996, many former patients had nowhere else to go. The institutions had been their homes, in the most coercive sense of that word, for years or decades, and the social stigma that had put them there in the first place did not disappear with the repeal of the law. The government apology acknowledged the harm. It did not undo it. Lisa's oatmeal and green paint, applied to Homer and Bart to simulate the symptoms of a disease that had been used to destroy thousands of people's lives in Japan within living memory, did not read as a domestic sitcom gag in that context. The word alone carried the entire weight of what the word had been used to justify, and The Simpsons had deployed it as a punchline. Japan did not negotiate with the episode. It did not require an edit or a content warning or a delay. It simply did not broadcast it. It was not available then, and it is not available now on Japanese streaming platforms. The episode about Lisa managing the household while Marge is in the hospital does not exist in Japan's official television record. The oatmeal is still on Homer's face. Japan just cannot see it. The looking for Mr. Goodbart situation in Russia reveals something about how the 2000s transformed the relationship between state power and cultural expression in ways that created new categories of broadcast concern that simply did not exist before. In the early period of The Simpsons, the categories that governments used to justify banning episodes were relatively familiar: obscenity, defamation, national security, cultural sensitivity, protection of children. These were categories with histories, legal precedents, established frameworks for how they applied. The category that caught looking for Mr. Goodbart in Russia was newer and less precisely defined. Offense to religious believers, or more specifically, the criminalization of behavior that mocks or disrespects religious spaces and practices. This category expanded in Russia during the 2000s as part of a broader alignment between the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church. The relationship between the Kremlin and the Patriarchate of Moscow deepened during Vladimir Putin's third presidential term. And one expression of that relationship was a series of legal provisions that made public expressions of religious disrespect a punishable offense. The Pussy Riot case in 2012, in which members of the feminist punk collective were imprisoned for performing a protest song in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, was the most internationally visible expression of this legal framework. The Sokolovsky case in 2016, the Pokemon Go blogger, was another application of it, and the one that the Looking for Mr. Goodbart episode directly intersected with. The timing was almost precise. Sokolovsky recorded himself playing Pokemon Go in the Yekaterinburg Cathedral in the summer of 2016. He was arrested, he was charged. His trial was ongoing when The Simpsons aired an episode in September 2016, in which Homer played a Pokemon Go parody inside a church for laughs. Russian Orthodox Church officials condemned the episode. Russian broadcasters pulled it. The episode was not making a statement about Russia. It was not aware of Sokolovsky's case specifically, though the writers were certainly aware of the Pokemon Go phenomenon that the episode was satirizing. The intersection was accidental. But accidental intersections between comedy and ongoing criminal proceedings tend to have a specific kind of force, because they reveal that the law and the joke are in conversation about the same thing. And the law has the power to determine which version of the conversation gets to be heard. Russia decided that Homer Simpson playing a mobile game in a cartoon church was not, in the current legal and cultural moment, available for broadcast. The episode is still not in Russian circulation in any official form. The A made Maggie situation in the Czech Republic, with its absence of explanation, reflects something that the other bands on this list do not. Most of the other bands, even when they were wrong or overreaching or culturally blinkered, were explicable. You could disagree with the reasoning while understanding what the reasoning was. The German law around Nazi symbols is clear. The Japanese sensitivity around the Pokemon seizure event is documented. The Chinese government's position on Tiananmen is, in its own way, explicit, even as its official position is denial. The Brazilian Tourism Board's objection was stated publicly and argued with specificity. The Czech Republic said no, and then said nothing else. There is no public record of which provision of Czech broadcast law the episode violated. There is no government statement about what specifically was objectionable. There is no advocacy organization that publicly campaigned for the ban. There is no cultural figure who made a visible argument that Maggie becoming a mob godchild was harmful to Czech society in a way that required regulatory action. There is just the ban. And the silence around it. The silence is, in a way, its own statement about how content restriction works. Not all bans are accompanied by manifestos. Not all decisions require public justification. A broadcast regulator in the Czech Republic determined that A Made Maggie should not air, and that determination was implemented, and no further explanation was provided, and The Simpsons continued to air in the Czech Republic without episode 2 of season 33. And the gap sat in the schedule without announcement, and most viewers never noticed. That is how a lot of content restriction actually works, not with the drama of a lawsuit threat, or the weight of a historical symbol, or the gravity of a documentary about child abuse. Just a quiet decision and a gap in the list, and no one explaining why. The Little Big Mom episode, in the context of everything Japan went through with its Hansen's disease policy, carries a specific weight that goes beyond the comedy of Lisa's domestic management scheme. What the episode inadvertently did by deploying the word leprosy as a comedic shorthand is reveal a particular blind spot that American entertainment has historically had about the distance between how a word functions as cultural shorthand in one context and how it functions as a live wound in another. The word leprosy in American comedic usage has a long history. It appears in jokes going back decades. It functions as a stand-in for something extreme and grotesque and vaguely medieval. A disease so severe that its name alone conveys absolute catastrophe. The joke works on the assumption that leprosy is safely historical, safely distant, something that does not happen to anyone you know in a contemporary context. The oatmeal and green paint work as comedic props because the audience understands that leprosy is being used as an exaggerated symbol of extreme illness rather than as a reference to a real experience that real people are living. In Japan, the audience could not make that assumption. Because the real experience was not distant, the leprosy prevention law had been on the books until 1996. People who had been forcibly institutionalized under that law were watching television in 2000. Their children, in some cases children who had been separated from them at birth under the same institutional framework, were watching television in 2000. The word was not available as comedic shorthand in a country where it had been, within living memory, the legal instrument of forced separation, forced sterilization, and the systematic destruction of people's right to live in their communities. The episode was never going to air in Japan, not because Japan lacked a sense of humor about difficult subjects. Japan has an extraordinarily sophisticated comedic culture that engages with difficult subjects regularly. But the specific subject deployed in the specific way at the specific moment in Japanese cultural history was not available for the kind of casual comedic use that the Simpsons writers applied to it. The writers did not know this. They were writing from inside their own cultural context where the word was available for that use. The word is only available for that use when you are far enough from the wound that it has become a symbol rather than a description of something that happened to someone. Japan was not far enough from the wound in 2000. Japan is still not far enough from it now. The episode is still not available on Japanese streaming platforms. The oatmeal and the green paint are still sitting in a file on a server somewhere, in a version of the episode that will not be served to Japanese users. The gap in the Japanese episode list is still there, alongside the gap that 30 Minutes Over Tokyo left. 2 episodes in a library of hundreds that Japan has determined it cannot receive. 2 episodes that The Simpsons made without knowing they were building something that Japan would have to refuse. The looking for Mr. Goodbart situation adds a dimension to the Russia ban that is worth pausing on because the episode itself, taken on its own terms, is not a commentary on religion. It is not an argument about whether sacred spaces should be respected. It is an episode about how completely Pokémon Go consumed people's attention in the summer of 2016, to the degree that people played it in places that their ordinary social awareness would have told them were inappropriate. Homer's obliviousness to the inappropriateness of playing Pokemon Get in a Church is the joke. His failure to notice that he is in a place where different rules apply is consistent with Homer's character across 37 seasons. Homer fails to notice things. Homer does not modulate his behavior based on context. This is fundamentally who Homer is. In Russia, the joke was not available in that framing because in Russia, the behavior Homer was depicting was not a comedy of obliviousness. It was a prosecutable offense. Ruslan Sokolovsky, who had done approximately what Homer was doing in the episode, was facing criminal charges at the time the episode aired. The Russian legal system was in the process of establishing that playing a mobile game in an Orthodox church was not a minor social transgression, but a crime against religious believers that warranted the full force of criminal prosecution. When you put those two things together, Homer in the cartoon church and Sokolovsky in the Russian courtroom, the episode changes shape. The comedy of Homer's obliviousness becomes something that the Russian state had decided was not available for comedic treatment. Because the behavior was not comedic in Russia, the behavior was criminal. And making it comedic, even in a cartoon, even with Homer Simpson as the vehicle, felt to Russian authorities like a mockery of the seriousness of what their courts had determined. Whether you agree with Russia's determination or not is a separate question. The determination was made, the episode was pulled, and Homer's cartoon church remains, in Russia, a place he cannot officially visit. There is a broader truth about The Simpsons that the graveyard of banned episodes illuminates, and it is this: the show was never really a cartoon in the way that word tends to get used dismissively. It was a piece of social observation delivered in animated form, and the animated form gave it a kind of permission that live-action television did not have. Homer Simpson could survive an explosion, Bart could fall off a building and walk away. The physics of the world the show operated in were flexible enough that the audience accepted a baseline level of unreality that allowed the writers to go places that realistic drama could not. But the permission that the animated form granted was not unlimited. It was not a blanket exemption from consequence. When the show reached into the real world, when it depicted real cities or referenced real events or cast real people, the animated insulation thinned. The show became subject to the same forces that any other piece of media would face when it made similar choices, the same legal frameworks, the same cultural sensitivities, the same governmental judgments about what their populations should and should not be allowed to encounter. The banned episodes are the moments when the animation stopped being sufficient protection, when the cartoon frame could not contain the weight of what was inside it, when what was happening on screen had enough connection to what had happened or was happening in the real world that the usual cartoon logic did not apply. Stark Raving Dad is the most extreme version of this. The episode is a cartoon in every technical sense. Homer is animated. Leon Kompowski is animated. The Springfield Mental Institution is animated. But the voice inside Leon is real. Michael Jackson's voice is real. And the allegations that made that voice impossible to broadcast in good conscience are real. The animation did not protect the episode. The real thing inside the cartoon made the cartoon real enough to require a real decision. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson is another version of it. The World Trade Center in the episode is drawn. Homer's car is drawn. The parking ticket and the attendance booth and the whole comedy of municipal bureaucracy is drawn. But the buildings are real buildings. They existed. They were in Lower Manhattan. And when they stopped existing, the drawn version of them became something that could not simply be animated back to life. The cartoon contained a record of a real thing that was gone, and for a period of years, that record was too raw to broadcast. The lesson that runs through all of these episodes is that the cartoon frame is powerful, but not absolute. The show could go places that other media could not, and it used that ability well for decades, but the places it went were still connected to the real world through the specific details it chose to include. And when those specific details became too heavy, the cartoon bent. That is not a criticism. That is a description of what it means to make something that actually engages with reality rather than simply gesturing in its direction. Engagement carries risk. The risk is sometimes a lawsuit, sometimes it is a government ban, sometimes it is an executive producer sitting alone with a documentary he found convincing and heartbreaking, deciding to bury something he loved. The show accepted those risks for 37 seasons, not always gracefully, not always correctly, but consistently, with the specific kind of courage that comes from refusing to make television that pretends the world is simpler than it is. 803 episodes, 11 in the graveyard, and counting. We started tonight in a graveyard. That was the framing. 11 episodes, hidden, pulled, restricted, banned, buried. A graveyard of television that the world decided it could not or would not keep in circulation. But sitting with all of these episodes together, something becomes clear that was not visible when you looked at them one by one. These episodes are not buried because they are bad. They are buried because they were real enough to matter. They touched something specific enough to wound. They landed in contexts they were not written for and produced reactions that the people who made them could not have fully anticipated. They were, in other words, doing what The Simpsons has always tried to do, which is make something that engages with the actual world rather than a sanitized approximation of it. Stark Raving Dad was pulled not because it was offensive, but because the warmth it carried became, after leaving Neverland, impossible to hold. The birthday song did not become a worse song. The goodbye scene did not become less quietly moving. The episode remained exactly what it had always been. But James L. Brooks watched a documentary and concluded that he could not keep something he loved without implicitly dismissing the pain of people who had been hurt. And he chose to lose the thing he loved. That is not a small thing. That is a moral choice made by a person who understood what he was giving up. The city of New York versus Homer Simpson was pulled because a building that appeared as background geography in a 1997 comedy became, in September 2001, something else entirely. The episode did not change. The towers did not survive. The episode came back eventually because grief changes shape over time, even when it does not disappear. The version of us that watches the episode now is not the version that watched it in 1997 or the version that could not watch it in 2002. We carry more than we used to. The episode holds it with us. Cape Fear was banned in Germany for 4 seconds of costuming because Germany has made a specific, considered decision about the weight that certain symbols carry. And that decision does not have an exemption for animated comedy. Blame It on Lisa required a formal apology to Brazil because the show depicted a real city with a sustained carelessness that its tourism board concluded was harmful. And the harm was real enough that a producer sat down and wrote the letter. 30 minutes over. Tokyo made a joke about a mass seizure event that had hospitalized hundreds of Japanese children 18 months earlier, and Japan did not find it funny because Japan was not required to find it funny. The Cartridge family was restricted in a country that had buried 16 children and a teacher the year before it aired. And the image of Homer Simpson pointing a handgun at a television set for laughs was not something that country's broadcasters could put in front of an audience in that particular moment. Weekend at Burnsies was restricted in places where the casual depiction of marijuana use was still considered a broadcast concern. And it is a measure of how the world has moved that the episode now reads as almost quaint in its transgression. Goo Goo Gai Pan is banned in China because it contains a tank and the acknowledgement that something happened at Tiananmen Square in 1989, and in China the tank is not a symbol and the acknowledgement is not available. The ban is about information. The ban is about what one of the most powerful governments on earth has decided its population should not be permitted to encounter, even when the encounter takes the form of Homer Simpson reading a sign and not understanding what it says. Little Big Mom was never broadcast in Japan because the word that its writers deployed as comedic shorthand was, in Japan, a word connected to a recent legal history of forced institutionalization, forced sterilization, and government-sanctioned destruction of people's lives. The distance between what the word meant in a Los Angeles writer's room in 1999 and what it meant in Japan in 2000 was not measured in miles. It was measured in history. Looking for Mr. Goodbart was banned in Russia because a court had recently convicted a man for doing something the episode depicted Homer doing for laughs. and the Russian state decided that something that its legal system had established as a crime was not available as a punchline. A Maid Maggie was banned in the Czech Republic for reasons that remain unexplained, which is a kind of ending that only The Simpsons could produce. Here's what these 11 episodes, laid end to end, actually describe. They describe a show that kept engaging with the world as it is and a world that kept changing around it. They describe the gap between intention and reception, between a writer's room in Los Angeles and a country 5,000 miles away where the same image carries an entirely different history. They describe the specific, painful experience of loving something and then being told, by law or by conscience or by the accumulated weight of grief, that the way you love it has to change. They describe what it costs to make something real. The Simpsons has been on the air since December 17, 1989. It has been renewed through season 40, 803 episodes, as of December 2025, with more coming. It will not stop. It seems incapable of stopping. And somewhere inside all of that endurance, across all of those seasons, there is a graveyard of things that were loved and then had to be let go. An episode about a birthday song, an episode about a parking ticket between two towers that no longer exist, an episode about a ski trip that made a joke about children being hospitalized, an episode about a tank in a square where history is not allowed to be discussed. They are all still there, in the gaps and the missing episode lists and the Disney Plus libraries with careful absences. They are what the show left behind when the world moved, and the show kept going. The Simpsons has never really been about Homer, or Marge, or Bart, or Lisa, or Maggie, not at its deepest level. It has been about the experience of watching your world change while you stay in the same living room, on the same couch, with the same family, year after year, and trying to find the humor and the humanity in the distance between who you were and who the world is asking you to become. The episodes in this graveyard are the moments when that distance got too large, when the world moved too fast, or the wound was too recent, or the tank was too real. They got there by being honest. And somewhere tonight, in a rerun that almost no one caught, or a DVD that someone still owns and has not watched in years, or a gap in a streaming library that scrolls past too quickly to notice, the birthday song is still playing, it is still quiet, it is still a little clumsy. And it still works because it was made with sincerity by people who cared about it in a time when it was possible to love it without complication. That time is over. The show goes on,